Rivets are connections made by drilling a hole through the parts to be joined, inserting a short length of wire or tubing into the hole, and then hammering the wire to upset the ends and form heads that are too wide to slip back out of the hole. Because they are done without heating the work, they can be used to join more than just metal. And they can be used to join as many layers as needed without a significant change in technique or additional time. There are many ways to make a rivet, but I'll be demonstrating the three shown in these examples: standard, flush, and tube. Standard rivets have a prominent raised head. Flush rivets have heads that are even with the surface. Tube rivets have large cone-shaped or flat heads with a hole in the middle. Riveting should usually be done after all the other work on your piece is finished. The first step in riveting is drilling holes where you want your rivets. If you're putting in more than one rivet, it's almost impossible to get the holes to line up if you drill your parts separately. Use a few drops of superglue to temporarily bond all your parts together to keep them aligned, and drill them all at once. It's important that the wire fits snugly in the hole you drill. Use the drill gauge to match your wire and drill bit. If your hole is too big, your wire can lean sideways in the hole and get bent over when you hammer it. Center punch where you want your holes. Make sure you do it on steel, because if you dent or bend your metal at this point, you'll pop your superglue. To save time, I'm punching and drilling for all three of the rivets I'm demoing in this video. Lubricate your bit and drill all the way through all of the layers. And I'm stepping up to the large hole that I need for the tube rivet. Deburr the holes by twisting the tip of a larger bit in the hole and barely shaving off the edge. You'll be squashing the end of your rivet wire to make your rivet heads. The shape that the wire end has to begin with will influence the shape of the head as it forms. Trim the end off with the flush cutters and file the end flat. Try fitting the wire into the drilled hole. If the wire is too big, try hosseling the hole, meaning running the drill bit lightly back through the hole to smooth it out and slightly enlarge it. If it's still too small, use your rat tail needle file to enlarge it until the wire just barely fits. I usually do this by turning the file with my fingertips because it takes off a smaller amount of metal. Be patient. The snugger the fit, the easier it'll be to control the hammering process. And be careful not to break the tip of the file off. Once the wire fits, push it through until you have a length of wire sticking out as long as it is thick. Then cut it with the flat side of the flush cutters toward your sheet, leaving the same amount on that side of the piece. File the cut end of the wire flat, using the hole in your metal to hold onto it. It is very important that the wire ends be only about as long as they are thick. Too long and they can bend over instead of squashing down. Too short and they'll be weaker but still functional, so err on the side of too short rather than too long. The next step is to hammer the wire to form the heads. A well-crafted rivet has heads the same size on both sides, so it's important to keep the wire centered as you hit it. This is made easier if you make a stack of masking tape pieces to act as a spacer between the top of the bench plate and the bottom of your piece. Hunker down so you can see both rivet heads as they form, and just a second. A quick word about hammering. Our goal is to hit the rivet the same way every time, with the hammer face parallel to the surface of the sheet. The rivet is tiny and the hammer face is tiny, and if you hit the sheet instead of the rivet, it'll make a mark that's hard to fix. So how you hold and swing the hammer makes a huge difference. Your wrist is an amazingly flexible joint, but we don't want flexibility right now, so keep it locked. Get your elbow up so your forearm is in line with your hammer handle and both are parallel to the tabletop. Hold the hammer at the end of the handle to get the most from its leverage. This will let you swing a shorter, more controlled arc, letting the leverage and weight of the hammer do the work for you. Again, don't swing from the wrist. Not only is it inconsistent, but if your arm and your hammer handle all stay in one line, your arm adds to the leverage of the hammer. Don't choke up. I know this feels like you have more control, but you're sacrificing leverage that you'll have to make up with hitting it harder with muscle. Don't stick your finger out either. It's the same thing as choking up. As I was saying, hunker down so you can make sure that the wire is centered in the sheet and see both rivet heads as they form. Give the rivet a few taps to begin to form the head. And then flip the whole thing over and give it a few taps on the other side. Both rivet heads form at the same time, but the one on top forms more quickly than the one on the bottom. Flipping keeps it even. Stop when your rivet end goes from looking like a cylinder to looking like a biscuit. Don't keep going until it looks like a pancake. Pancakes make weak rivets. Your finished rivet should be identical on both sides. From the side, the heads should be biscuits, not pancakes. And from above, they should be circular with no faceting because you kept your wrist locked, your elbow up, and you hit them the same way every time. The technique for flush rivets is almost identical to standard rivets, except that after drilling your hole, instead of just deburring the edges, you bevel them. When the rivet is hammered, the head fills the bevel, so some of the head is actually below the surface of the sheet. This allows you to file the head flush with the surface and still have a working rivet. While not as strong as standard or tube rivets, they're more subtle, and can even disappear entirely if you use the same metal for both the sheet and the rivet. After drilling your holes, use the same technique as you would for deburring the edge, but instead of barely shaving the edge, give the bit a few extra twists to bevel the hole. Don't get too carried away or you'll have a hard time filling the oversized bevel back up with the rivet head. On the left is what it should look like compared to a deburred hole on the right. Trim and file the end of the wire as you would with standard rivets. and cut it so there's an extra bit on both sides as long as it is thick. File the cut end. Even though you'll be filing off the rivet heads in the end, it makes it easier to fill the bevel if the head shapes evenly. As before, hammer the wire to upset the ends until they form biscuit shapes. You'll notice here that I'm hammering them just a little bit extra. Still biscuits, not pancakes, but enough to ensure that the bevel gets filled up. It also helps to anneal the wire before you start. Note, at this point, it'll look like a good standard rivet. You do not hammer the heads flush with the surface. Next, use a flat file to file the rivet heads down to the surface. Keep the file parallel to the surface or you'll end up removing sheet at the edge. Also, extend your index finger so you can put the pressure where you need it. At first, the rivet head will be keeping the file away from the surface, but as you remove more of the head and near the surface, you'll start to see file marks out away from the rivet. As you continue, the file marks will get closer and closer to the head, and the head will get closer to being flush. When only a whisper of the head is left, switch to a flat needle file and use the tip of your index finger to put pressure on the file right on top of the rivet. Your rivet will be fully flush when the file marks continue across the rivet without a break, and your rivet just looks like a colored dot. You should also be able to close your eyes and run your finger across the head without feeling it. Repeat the filing process on the other head. While you're watching me file, if you mess up a flush rivet, it can be difficult to fix. With a standard rivet, you can just file off one of the heads and poke out what's left. But the whole point of a flush rivet is to be able to file off the heads and not have it come apart. So here are some tips. Number 1, help ensure success. Don't make big flush rivets. Keep them 12 gauge or smaller, or it's hard to shape the heads in a way that fills the bevel. Don't do them in thin metal. It's harder to hammer the rivets without stretching the hole and buckling the sheet. Don't over bevel the hole, or you'll have a harder time filling it. Don't underhammer the rivet heads, or they won't fill the bevel. If you don't fill the bevel, you get a crescent-shaped groove next to your rivet head. Before you file the rivet head away completely, check for the grooves that tell you the bevel isn't filled. Hammer the rivet some more to try to fill the bevel the rest of the way. Number 2, if you still mess up, center punch the exact center of the rivet head and try to drill it out using the same bit you made the original hole with. Chances are you'll miss the center, but you can probably go up a wire size, re-drill to fit the new size, and try again. Tube rivets are almost completely different. Because the tubing is hollow, smooshing the metal to form rivet heads would only crush the tubing. Instead, we use bullet-shaped punches to stretch the tubing until it forms cones, and then hammer these cones down flat against the surface. Start by annealing your tubing. We're asking a lot of it, stretching it out to form a rivet head. It'll often tear if it's not dead soft. If the tubing has any nicks or blemishes in the edge, it'll tear if we try to stretch it into rivet heads. So start by filing the end of the tubing so it's squared off, smooth, and even. The easiest way to do this is to turn the tubing with your fingers as you push the file forward. Then deburr the outside edge and use a rat tail file to clean up the inside edge. Try fitting the tubing into the hole. If it's too big, try hosling first, and then filing with your rat tail if that isn't enough. But be patient. This process is much harder if your tubing fits loosely in the hole. Push the tubing into the hole until about 1 to 3 millimeters sticks out the other side. Tube rivet heads are much larger than standard or flush, so you don't need them to be as long as the tubing is thick. In fact, the further it sticks out, the more likely it is to tear as you stretch it into a rivet head. Mark where you want to cut the tubing with a file or a scribe and pull it back out of the hole. Never, ever, ever, ever use wire cutters to cut tubing. It crushes it, and crushed tubing is unusable. Use a jeweler's saw with a 4/0 blade to saw the tubing to length. I know 4/0 seems tiny compared to the tubing, but the tubing's made of very thin sheet, and a bigger blade will snag and break. You'll notice that I'm using a special tubing cutting jig to help keep the tubing from turning as I saw it, and to keep my cut at 90 degrees to its length. If you don't have one of these, you can do without it, but do make sure that the end is 90 degrees to its length, or you'll get an eccentric oval rivet head. Pop the tubing back into the hole and clean up the cut edge the same way you did with the other end. Put one of the bullet-shaped punches in a small vise and place your tubing on top of the pointy end. Then, awkwardly holding your workpiece and the other punch in the same hand, put the pointy end of the other punch in the other end of the tubing. Try to keep the tubing centered in the sheet and the punches straight up and down. Then use a chasing hammer to tap the punch, driving it into the tubing and flaring it out. By the way, this is all much easier if you get a helper to swing the hammer for you. You can do it by yourself, but as you can see, it's awkward. Recenter the tubing as you need to. Once you've started the flare, flip and flare the other end. Like the wire rivets, the top head develops faster than the bottom. Flipping it helps to keep them even. Keep going until the narrow end of the flare goes all the way to the sheet. At this point, you have a working rivet and can stop if you like the cone shape. But for this exercise, we're going to keep going. To make sure the cones go all the way to the surface, try to push the rivet back and forth through the hole. If it pops back and forth, use the bullet punches to flare it further. Also, if the tubing is torn at this point, cut the head off with your flush cutters and pull out what's left. Try again with an annealed piece of tubing or a shorter rivet head. Finally, use a riveting hammer and bench plate to stretch the cones the rest of the way down to the surface of your sheet. Go easy. They should touch all the way around but not be smashed looking. A good tube rivet is the same on both sides, concentric and smooth.